All right, welcome back. That's not our next speaker. This one is. Here we go. All right, our next speaker is Emily Harvey. Emily is an art historian with a focus on 19th century women's material culture, jewelry, and dress. Emily has a background in historic preservation and museum studies and recently finished her master's degree in decorative arts, design history, and material culture from the Bard Graduate Center in New York City. Congratulations. Her talk today is Seeing Women, the Rise in Popularity of Women's Vision Aids in the 19th Century America.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the DAR Museum for inviting me to speak. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to my project entitled Seeing Women, the Rise and Popularity of Women's Vision Aids in 19th Century America. This project originated as my master's thesis and is near and dear to my heart. Straddling the line between assistive devices and fashionable accessories, 19th century vision aids such as spectacles and lorgnettes were a topic of debate among many upper and middle class American women. While previous scholarship has focused its attention on the popularity of vision aids in the early 20th century, this project dispels the myth of their universal unpopularity in the 19th century by tracking the changes in American attitudes towards women wearing vision aids over this period. Using portraits and photographs of 19th century women, I tell the story of the utilization of vision aids as items of individual expression and self-fashioning. In addition, I examine published textual sources such as etiquette guides and popular magazines that prescribed how and when 19th century women should wear their vision aids. Alongside these sources, I draw on the 19th century novel to lend insight into the unconscious inclinations and biases women may have had towards vision aids, as in many novels, only older women tended to wear their aids all the time. This research deepens our understanding of women's self-fashioning in 19th century America by showing that women exercised agency in choosing how they wore and styled their vision aids by the end of the period. Thus, by combining pictorial, material, textual, and literary sources, I argue that vision aids did not suddenly become popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but in fact slowly grew in popularity and acceptability from the beginning of the period when they were only acceptable in theaters and outdoors, to its end when vision aids were a popular and sometimes obligatory feminine social accessory. Overall, this project traces how attitudes, social rules, and vision aid technologies changed over the course of the 19th century, beginning with its late 18th century precedents. By the latter half of the 18th century, vision aids had become a common accessory and acceptable aid for men. However, only two styles of vision aids were seen as feminine and acceptable for women to use in certain public activities, the lorgnette and the spyglass. The lorgnette, typically seen with a long handle, could also be disguised with a fashionable accessory at the time, the fan. Evolving from the standard folding fan, the lorgnette fan featured a small lens that was placed inside the base or handle and was made popular by the nobility in France. This allowed the lady to use the lorgnette fan like normal, potentially including the social performances and gestures associated with fan etiquette of the period. While it's unclear where these lorgnette fans would have been used, because evidence of them comes from collections rather than pictorial representations, the most appropriate scenarios would have most likely been outdoors on promenades and while viewing theatrical performances. Both situations would have called for fans to be present, whether to cool and shade a lady from the sun, or to send messages to others in the theater. In the low lights of the theater, women could use these special fans with a built-in vision aid to see the performance while not using the masculine vision aids of the time, which primarily consisted of monocles and some variations of opera glasses. Another type of vision aid that women used at the opera or during other indoor performances was the spyglass, which can be closely associated with contemporary telescopes. Consisting of a long lens and a decorated metal tube, the spyglass is used to see things and peoples from distances, both indoors and occasionally outdoors. And while the lorgnette fan was created and used mainly by nobility in France, The spyglass was used throughout Europe, with many being brought to England as a souvenir from grand tours. The use of the spyglass, like many other English fashions, subsequently traveled to North America. And unlike the lorgnette fan, the spyglass is commonly found in pictorial representations of 18th century European women. A 1784 French fashion plate shows a fashionable woman using a spyglass to view something in the sky above. And while fashion plates were primarily used to show the trending fashions of the time, they often give an insight into women's daily tasks and recognizable accessories. Jessica Glasscock, in her book Making a Spectacle: A Fashionable History of Glasses, makes the point that these spyglasses signaled a woman's social and educational standing because they were socially acceptable to be used while viewing art. Glasscock features a caricature by James Gilray that depicts the act of using a spyglass to view art high on the ceiling at James Christie's to support her interpretation. This caricature and many other pictorial representations of spyglasses suggest that these things were acceptable for upper-class women of the late 18th century. Other illustrations, however, highlight socially unacceptable uses of spyglasses, such as the 18th century American cartoon titled The Wishing Females. This cartoon shows two women using a spyglass to ogle men, specifically soldiers, from their perch inside a house. Thus, spyglasses were also associated with notions of predatory women, tainting this American idea of a pure and moral woman. While there were social negatives associated with the spyglass, overall they were deemed acceptable in the 18th century when used properly. This acceptability appears to have continued into the 19th century in both Europe and America, and can be seen in a portrait of Margaret Stuyvesant Rutherford White, in which White is shown holding what we think is a spyglass in her hand. Although there is little evidence about vision aid etiquette in 18th century America, it is reasonable to assume that many upper-class American women followed the vision trends of England and France, as they did in their clothing and accessories. This means that American women likely use spyglasses and lorgnettes in public, specifically at the theater, while the increase in reading culture and female literacy rates at the time suggests that some women were using vision aids for close vision, particularly for private use in the home. The growth of American print culture also included this growth of pictorial representations in the 19th century, like this one, that show this rising acceptance. And the continued use of spyglasses specifically from the 18th through the 19th century suggests that vision aids were becoming consistent in women's daily lives and incorporated into fashion trends. The early 19th century was a time of transition and innovation for the newly independent United States. For women of this period, this was a time of quickly changing fashion trends and social expectations. The naturalistic and flowing empire style of dress, characteristic of the first several decades of the century, introduced a plethora of new accessories. The most important accessory of the time was the bonnet, which many upper class women could not afford to be seen without, since it kept their skin and, importantly, their eyes protected from the sun, and their modesty and reputations intact. Unlike the bonnet, which became second nature to many women, the lack of pictorial representations of women wearing vision aids outside of the theater suggests it was uncommon for a woman to be seen all the time in public with a vision aid on her person. As previously discussed, certain activities such as the theater provided these acceptable spaces, but in terms of pictorial representations, specifically fashion plates during this period, a lady is rarely represented with a lorgnette or spyglass visibly displayed upon her body. By this, it can be inferred that women were not wearing them on them or outside of a pocket. Instead, they were often tucked away in a bag or a pouch and taken out when needed. This could also be because of the fashion trends of the time that, as mentioned, called for simple forms of dress with minimal but essential accessories upon the body. One of the few times it was deemed socially appropriate for vision aids, either distant or close, to be visible and ever present on the body, was if the woman was of old age, or if the woman was already classified as a quote-unquote spinster. Dressing appropriately for one's age and not being seen as extravagant was important for ladies of upper and middle class society on both sides of the Atlantic. In England, etiquette guides generally criticized women for over-accessorizing their bodies and counseled clean and natural lines. For example, an 1811 London-based etiquette guide advised ladies, quote, wishing to be thought superior, reject external ornament, lest they forget external decency. By affectation, render what is called a learned woman, a kind of scarecrow to her own sex, end quote. The author's point of view towards women who went against the grain was one of discontent and disgust towards those who seeked individuality. Another critically important reason why vision aids were viewed somewhat negatively in this part of the century was that good vision was viewed as a sign of good health, morals, and hygienic practices. And these traits were desirable for both men and women. But for women, they reflected a proper upbringing and an ability to take care of themselves and others. The Lady's Stratagem, a compilation of 1820s etiquette guides from Europe, discusses multiple remedies for preventing and slowing down weakening vision. This includes one interesting recipe to strengthen the eye that's seen on the screen. Recipes like this, suggesting quote unquote cures for the eye, were desired by women. However, it's unclear whether 19th century etiquette guide authors and women in general maybe believed that vision aids, if worn frequently, could lead to worsening vision. For all 19th century, early 19th century women, I'm really going to drill this in. There was one time and place that vision aids were socially acceptable, and that was at theater and opera performances. With two types of vision aids typically associated with these activities, lorgnettes, spy glasses, and now some variations of opera glasses, which just a bit binoculars. The opera, often dimly lit with the richest guests placed in boxes high up and far from the stage, was a key place for women to use their vision aids. Not only could they be used to view the performances, but they were also associated with spying and observing others. An 1830 fashion plate from the Belle Assemblée in France, for example, showcases a woman sitting at the theater, represented by the plush red velvet balustrades, holding a lorgnette with what looks to be a gold handle. Lorgnettes with handles were the most common vision aid at the opera, as they were seen as elegant and easy to store when not in use. Since they were often only used in these scenarios, they were often elaborately decorated to fit the venue and significantly more detailed than vision aids that were used for day-to-day activities in the home. Lorgnettes for the opera only grew in elaborateness as the century moved forward. Another type of vision aid depicted in the early 19th century was the chain lorgnette. For example, an 1821 fashion plate from Fashionable magazine shows a woman riding her horse with a lorgnette around her neck. The chain lorgnette was much more adaptable to daily and or outdoor activities, such as horse riding, than the traditional lorgnette with a handle. Often seen with one or two lenses, the lorgnette on a chain varied according to the user's specifications. The structure of the one depicted, while similar to a monocle, has a thinner wire. And it seems that these chain lorgnettes cannot stick comfortably in an eye or on the face like a monocle would. A chain lorgnette in the collection of the MFA Boston is a good example of how chain lorgnettes could disguise themselves as necklaces. This example has ornate chain detailing at the top and a modest lorgnette at the bottom, then it folds inside a rectangular case upon which we think the owner's name is inscribed. And the ability to personalize the chain lorgnette may have encouraged more women to wear vision aids while also being able to present them as a piece of jewelry. That might have increased their social acceptability by the 1840s. And with a broader range of choices, women could have more freedom in what they wore and were more comfortable with the styles they chose. These women now really had a choice to hide or display their vision aids. And while pictorial representations of women wearing vision aids increased towards the 1840s, they were still limited in numbers. For women who did choose to display themselves with their vision aids, little evidence survives on their reasoning for doing so. However, it could be due to the growing sentiment that education was important for women, a rise in literacy rates in both US and Europe, as well as greater encouragement for women to take part in outdoor activities. For example, this portrait of Lucy Elizabeth Beatrice from 1820 is kind of a rare example of a woman folding and choosing to highlight her lorgnette. Beatrice was an English woman known for her stage acting, and she could have chosen lorgnette as her prop for its relationship to the theater. A physical marker of her role in performances where so many vision aids were used every night. Along with actual situations and mentions, vision aids were also commonly found in early fiction of the century. This fiction responded to the rising popularity of reading and the novel. There were short and serial novels in American periodicals, but for much of the early half of the 19th century, the large and now classic novels still read today came from England and other European countries. For vision aid etiquette, many of these novels were another way in which the appropriateness of vision aids was depicted and where women, young and old, learned where and when they could possibly wear their aids without the words being explicitly stated to them. A popular and well-published author in the early 19th century was British-born Jane Austen. Austen's popularity and influence on English society lends a solid viewpoint on early 19th century culture. Austen published 4 novels between 1811 and 1815, and 2 more were posthumously published in 1817. Of these 6 novels, only one explicitly mentions any style of vision aid in connection with women. While this could be due to the plots of each novel, it could also be due to Austen's focus on young female protagonists and their concern with their appearances in public. One character in Austen's 1815 novel, Emma, plays into the social stereotype that it was only acceptable for elderly women and spinsters to wear spectacles. And while spectacles like those in modern day were not super common in the early 19th century, it is possible for those that always needed vision assistance, spectacles were the best option. The quote of most interest and relevance to spectacles is when Miss Bates, a side character, discusses her mother's need for spectacles and the good they have done for her as she aged. Miss Bates states, quote, "And indeed, though my mother's eyes are not so good as they were, she can see amazingly well still, thank God. With the help of spectacles, it is such a blessing," end quote. Directly showing the correlation between age and vision aids in the early 19th century. Austen's use of spectacles in reference to 2 older women, one of which was a spinster, feeds into this stereotype. While not many early American novels, or even in general early 19th century novels, mention vision aids, a publication such as Emma from a well-known woman author is important for displaying and influencing real-life social values and lessons. However, by the middle of the century, vision aids started to become more popular among the upper and middle classes and feature in popular magazines of the period. During the middle of the 19th century, technological discoveries were made to better understand the eye and how humans see, and the fashionability and acceptance of vision aids for women increased as well. At the same time, the number of print magazines in the United States began to increase, as did the array of contributors' opinions on the appropriateness of vision aids for middle and upper class women. Several of these magazines bring to light how important the mid-19th century was to the rise in fashionability of vision aids and how rapidly changing fashion trends and a growing middle class led to those opinions. Spectacles, another word for eyeglasses today, but in the 19th century, that was often the only term to describe how vision aids that included 2 lenses, one for each eye with a wire frame that was used to put the spectacles on the face. In earlier centuries, there were spectacle-like vision aids, but they differed in design and how they were attached to the face, while also mainly being for men. A 1787 etching of Benjamin Franklin by Charles Wilson Peale shows this sort of earlier model. But for younger women, a larger number of pictorial representations start to show women wearing spectacles towards the end of the 1830s and into the 1840s, suggesting that it was not common for them to choose spectacles over lorgnettes for portraits before this period. An 1839 portrait of Miss Antoine Julienne Meffray-Rouson is one of the earliest pictorial representations of a woman wearing spectacles. Meffray-Rouson's spectacles look to be made of a gold or gold-plated wire frame that became a common style of spectacles in the United States. And it can be assumed by Meffray-Rouson's fashion that this was an official portrait. And instead of choosing to take off her spectacles, Rousson decided to show herself wearing them. Another key portrait done only 2 years after Meffray-Rouson's shows another popular vision aid style of the period, which is the combination of the lorgnette and the spectacle. The 1841 portrait of Agatha Petronella Hartson shows her holding an open gold chain lorgnette in her hand. This style of visionade became popular with women of the mid to late 19th century due to their ability to be more adaptable to reading than the one lens chain lorgnette popular in the early 19th century. Women continued to use this form of visionade into the latter half of the century, with sets of both lenses for near and farsightedness beginning to be seen together in one pair of spectacles, as a lorgnette by Cartier, currently at the Met, showcases. At the same time as portraits of women wearing visionades increased and vision technology was evolving, there was also an increase in magazines and columns devoted to or mentioning visionades. One key source is Peterson Magazine, which was devoted to the news, fashions, and fictional stories. Many women shown wearing visionades in Peterson Magazine keep up with the stereotype, and they're no longer deemed to be young and who read often. However, an 1865 Peterson Magazine article mentions younger girls wearing visionades. The column includes a young woman of 25 inquiring to her uncle about the news of the day by asking, quote, "Do the girls wear spectacles and carry books as of old?" End quote, suggesting that the early 19th century idea that girls wearing visionades at the time were meant to be reading, and that daily activity was deemed a socially acceptable time to wear their visionades. Another Peterson Magazine entry, this one from 1854, discusses the use of a lorgnette when in high society locations such as Saratoga Springs. Describing the entrance of one particularly high society lady, the column states, quote, "The curtain fell at last, and Miss Cornelia, all in a flutter of gratified vanity, consigned her pearl-mounted lorgnette to her companion," end quote, showing that Miss Cornelia knows both proper social etiquette of not using visionades to stare at another person and the vanity of upper-class women to not be seen with their visionades in hand. At the same time as magazines and other nonfiction literature were on the rise for women, the popularity of the novel, particularly American novels, continued to rise. During this period, many now classic novels were written, such as The Scarlet Letter and Moby Dick. Alongside these novel books, such as the Bible, comprehensive etiquette guides, and small periodicals were still common reading materials, especially for times when reading aloud was requested. And while the novel was growing in mid-19th century America, the mention of visionades was still notably absent. This can potentially speak to the slow acceptance of visionades into general daily life in American society. In England, however, women writers such as Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Clegg Gaskell were again tying visionades to older women. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, gives the reader a look into the styles of spectacles available to the women of the period by stating, quote, "It was kept by an old dame who wore horn spectacles on her nose and black mittens on her hands," end quote. It has been incredibly difficult to track down extant examples of horn spectacles. It's possible that Bronte chose to feature her character in them because they were unusual or old-fashioned. And while Bronte highlights the styles of spectacles commonly seen during the period, Gaskell continues the stereotype that older women were the ones who wore them, never once mentioning a younger or unmarried woman wearing spectacles in her books. In Gaskell's novel Cranford, originally published in 1853, Miss Mattie, described as an older and kind woman, is consistently looking for or wiping her spectacles. Gaskell, seeing them as an extension of Miss Mattie, states observations such as, quote, "I saw the tears stealing down the well-worn furrows of Miss Mattie's cheeks, and her spectacles often wanted wiping," end quote. By writing about spectacles sort of as an extension of Miss Mattie herself, Gaskell suggests that some of her readers might have believed that once a person began to use a visionade, it became a part of their identity. Continuing through the mid-19th century, while magazines and fiction, such as Peterson, were beginning to showcase visionades more and more, many women in the United States still relied heavily on fashion plates coming from Europe and etiquette guides to ensure they were not stepping too far from socially determined boundaries. Fashion plates, both from Europe and some now from America, began to have full pages dedicated to accessories and close-ups of fashionable details. And slowly but surely, these plates began to include lorgnettes, either in action or placed in a woman's hand. An 1844 winter fashion plate shows a fashionable woman using a silver lorgnette to read a letter, a common day-to-day activity. Another fashion plate, albeit 2 years earlier than the previous example, has a page dedicated to bonnets, with one specific example showing a woman turning to highlight the back of the bonnet while holding a lorgnette in her outstretched hand. These two fashion plates and many more show the increased comfortability with using lorgnettes in day-to-day activities and the acceptance of them entering the fashion world. As fashions moved into the more elaborately decorated styles of the late 19th century, vision aids were still increasing in elaborateness. And while it may seem that people of the mid-19th century were becoming comfortable with the idea of accessories and vision aids, several social etiquette guide authors believe that accessories and vision aids did too much to a woman's body. A direct callback to the more naturalistic styles found earlier in the century. An 1866 Civil War etiquette guide explicitly states, quote, "If we were allowed to say anything to the ladies concerning dress in a dictatorial way, and were sure of being obeyed, we should order them generally to dress less," end quote. This passage describes a desire by one man for women to dress simply without adornment. However, for many women, that was not what they wanted. By the late 19th century, heavy adornment was all the rage, and with vision aids becoming a desired commodity for all middle and upper class women. The late 19th century, so in 1870, vision aids, when used inappropriately, were still seen as intrusive into the personal lives of American society and socially unacceptable to wear at certain events. The 1870 Bizarre Book of Decorum, which is like the most popular etiquette guide of the time, explicitly states that, quote, "Nothing can be more ill-bred, and we assert it in the face of assenting fashion, than ogling a stranger in the street through an eyeglass, or serving an opposite neighbor at the theater with a lorgnette," end quote. Making it clear that it was inappropriate for them when vision aids were used incorrectly and for the wrong reasons. As time progressed towards the turn of the century, members of high society demanded increasingly ornate vision aids, specifically lorgnettes, and turned them from an accessory appropriate only for select events and activities to something a woman could really not be seen without. As stated earlier, during the late 19th century, vision aids started to become available not just to the middle and upper class, but now they were becoming available to the lower class. This was in part due to the invention of the pince-nez, which was a style of vision aid that was cheap to produce and could be easily adapted to all face shapes and sizes. An 1870 to 1880 example from the New York Historical Society shows just how small the pince-nez was and how adaptable they could be to everyday activities and work with the lower classes. They pinched onto your nose. Due to the thin wire, the pince-nez blended into the user's face, drawing less attention to the fact that the person needed vision assistance. At the same time as the pince-nez was becoming popular, the 19th century invention, the photograph, became affordable to most people. Photography is one of the best ways to understand how women in the late 19th century understood and saw themselves. At the time, sitting for a photograph was much more efficient than sitting for a painting. And while it cannot be assumed that this was women showing the ideal or real versions of themselves, it can be assumed that they did not mind wearing their vision aids in photographs. An 1895 to 1910 portrait of Clara Cyprell shows the growing interest in portrait photography and also highlights the relative invisibility of the pince-nez. You really have to look for it. At the same time as the pince-nez and vision aid accessibility were becoming widespread among the lower classes in America.
If you know your party's extension, you may dial it at any time or dial 9 for company directory. For sales, please press 1. For service, press 2.
The middle and upper classes were still making their vision aids more and more elaborate as they became socially acceptable for all of us. So at the same time as this is when the middle class really began to buy standardized vision aids from the newly kind of formed department store catalogs, which you can see here. The upper class elite were creating custom vision aids from some of the top jewelry designers in the world. Some of the most popular lorgnette designers of the period were Tiffany & Co., Theodore Bissart, and occasionally Cartier. These pieces range from engraved gold and silver frames to mother of pearl inlays surrounding the lenses. These customizations even included frames made up of diamonds and precious stones. One such example was shown by Cartier, was shown previously. And while customizations were popular for all styles of vision aids, the lorgnette 100% remained the most popular for the upper class. And this rise in fashionability of vision aids in the late 19th century was seen most often with the lorgnette, and the upper class increasing reliance on the aid as a replacement for the more middle class pince-nez and spectacles. By the 1890s, the lorgnette appeared frequently in upper class fashion plates, which were becoming more and more realistic. For example, this 1895 fashion plate shows a woman in an upper class dinner dress gracefully holding her lorgnette out, almost using it as an extension of her hand. Alongside fashion plates, the lorgnette was often written about in fashion magazines as a great accessory to one's outfit while still being practical for everyday use. An 1895 Harper's Bazaar article mentions and dedicates an entire column to the lorgnette and its advantages to society. A section of the article is seen here. While this passage shows that it was well documented that the upper class enjoyed lorgnettes, it can be incredibly difficult to find pictorial representations or photographs of the women wearing or using them. Pictorial representations of upper class women, families like the Astors and Vanderbilts, were staged, especially when the women were in costume for a ball. However, genre painting artists at the time still depicted women of the upper class with their vision aids. The woman in Mary Cassatt's Reading Le Figaro, for example, is the artist's mother, who raised Cassatt in a comfortable upper class household. This upbringing gave Cassatt an insider's knowledge of how upper class women use their vision aids informally and formally, and leads to her paintings being good evidence of upper class life in the late 19th century, as seen in another of Cassatt's paintings in the Loge. During the late 19th century, the upper class's connection to vision aids is best reported in text, and is critical to understanding the rise and acceptance of vision aids in the late 19th century. By the 1890s, several magazines, including Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar, were important to America's upper class and often dictated fashions. November 1894 issue of Vogue magazine, highlighting new and lasting fashion trends, specifically mentions lorgnettes by saying, quote, "So are the old Queen Anne lorgnettes with their very quaint foldings and very useless wee glass," end quote, making clear that lorgnettes were going to stay a trend for the new future. The idea that the glasses of lorgnettes, in this case referring to lenses, were becoming useless or not prescriptive at all was another source of contention that made its way into popular culture. The Cosmopolitan magazine issued a poem about lorgnettes in April 1889 that revealed quite a surprising twist at the end about a woman's lorgnette, and the poem is seen here. The last line is important. This poem, along with many other magazine entries, shows how over time the lorgnette became so crucial to the social etiquette of upper class America that women were using bad vision and fake lenses to flirt or appear attractive to men. One etiquette guide of the time remarked on this phenomenon by stating, quote, "It is quite clear that the whole world of fashion has not all of a sudden become so afflicted with short-sightedness as to render the use of artificial means for its relief universally necessary," end quote, remarking on how the upper class had seemingly popped up with spectacles all at once. Similar to the mid-19th century, much of what influenced the acceptance of vision aids was fiction. Most importantly, women readers consciously and subconsciously brought these messages of the fictional world into the real world, lending a hand in this steady evolution of acceptance of vision aids. Two novels by now we have an American, he's American-British, but American author, Henry James, shows a glimpse of the attitudes and understandings of vision aids both in and outside of America. In James's 1881 novel, Portrait of a Lady, James describes one of his characters as an avid spectacle user. While no descriptive language is really used for the reader to visualize how the spectacles specifically looked, the spectacle user is also described as, quote, "one of them, a person of certain age, in spectacles, with a fresh complexion and a full cheek," end quote, leading the viewer to acknowledge that, like earlier in the century, it was still acceptable for older women to be seen and described with their spectacles. Along that same note, Henry James' 1886 novel, The Bostonians, spectacles were metaphorically attached to their owner. One quote from the novel states, quote, "At this, she transferred her eyes to him, gazing at him solemnly out of the pervasive window of her spectacles," end quote. describing the idea that vision aids could be seen as a window into the wearer's mind and soul, and gazing at someone through said vision aid could still be seen as invasive and rude. By the turn of the century in 1900, it can be said that vision aids had become an important object of middle and upper class society. Magazines, novels, department store catalogs, and high-end designers fed the trend by giving creative freedom to the buyer who could afford to commission custom pieces, and by displaying standardized vision aids at different price points for those with smaller budgets. However, this idea did not fully come into fruition in America until the late 19th century, with many in society slowly but still reluctant to accept vision aids in activities outside the theater and outdoors. They could be seen as invasive into the personal lives of others, an indicator of old age, and often associated with the growing bookishness and education of young women, which was not always popular. As technology and fashion changed, the acceptance of the vision aids also changed, as the aids can now provide better personalized lenses and due to stylistic developments such as pince-nez. For women, these vision aids not only mark them as an educated and literate woman during the rise of the suffrage movement, but they also signified the woman's interest in trending fashions and their ability to keep up with society. While some scholars argue that the rise in popularity of vision aid did not occur until early to mid 20th century, I think this project and myself show that the fashionability and social acceptance of vision aids steadily did grow through the 19th century, with much of upper and middle class society accepting of them and their helpfulness by 1890s. Thank you. Yeah, so you're asking about what the thing is on the left with her. Yeah, so I took this out of my presentation for time, but basically before the 19th century, you did see women with like spectacle-like glasses, but oftentimes they were in these scientific types of paintings like this one. And you can't see under her veil, but I would assume it's probably either hooked to the veil or there's a head strap. Yeah. They were very scientific before the 19th century. In terms of masculinity, I don't think so. I read a lot of magazines, and a lot of times, I mean, this association with being educated and reading and stuff does have that implication of masculinity in the 19th century. But you never really read of them being, say, oh, this is too masculine for you. They just kind of kept away from like the monocle and opera glasses before the 19th century were kind of just seen as a male thing, but then those kind of evolved into gender neutral. Not much in the literature. I mean, in portraits, sometimes the men will have very simple ones that are just wire and kind of boring. And women, they wanted all the money and the glitz and the glam, so they decorated theirs. But when it came to daily use, I mean, they pretty much all had the same because lenses and everything were becoming standardized. Most of the prescriptions didn't become standardized until the 20th century, but when it was for reading and stuff, they pretty much all just. I have heard that, yeah. It's actually the opposite in the 19th century. So, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, there was this whole concept of women were attractive when they looked sick. When it primarily had to do with like tuberculosis and stuff. So if they wanted to be super thin, super pale, basically a ghost, and this idea of having bad vision or making someone think you had bad vision kind of contributed to this idea of, oh, they were unwell or sick. It was Victorians were weird when it came to like wanting to be